we'll be covering chapters 7, 8, and 9. So notice this area here that's brought up in some different context throughout the textbook about battleground states. When we talk about the Electoral College, some states matter more than others because of their competitiveness and the possibility of both major candidates winning that state. So there's a few of the battleground states that you should be aware of: Colorado, Iowa, New Hampshire, Ohio, Virginia, and Wisconsin. So if you're a strategist for one of the two major candidates in a presidential campaign, you're going to be thinking about some states more than others, and these would be some of the states that you would pay more attention to. And so this is before the 2016 election, but you can see here 33 states have voted for the same party in the past 5 presidential elections. Well, we have 50 states plus the District of Columbia, so you're looking at a minority of the states then that would really matter to campaign workers, strategists of the two major parties. So here you're looking at Florida, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Nevada, New Mexico, Colorado, Iowa, New Hampshire, Ohio, Virginia, and Wisconsin. So we can see that some states are going to get more attention than others. And these were the states that in very narrow ways, every one of them went for Trump over Clinton. And there was some projection in the polling that it was going to go the other way, and turns out not to be that way. And that's why, even though there was a lot of predictions likewise, Trump went on to win, winning these 4 states by a total of votes that could sit in University of Michigan Stadium, which is a big stadium, but still roughly around 100,000 people out of over 100 million people voting. You can see in 2016, you're looking at those upper Midwest states that had fairly consistently gone for the Democrat candidate: Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and now all 4 went for Trump. And that led to then the victory for now President Trump in that election. When we look at voting, so that discussion there was just talking about certainly the potential quirkiness of the Electoral College. Do keep in mind that you can, again, win the popular vote and lose the Electoral College. Another issue is just the overall structure of a voting system. How long, for example, should people have to wait to get a ballot? I can say that I've never had to wait more than a few minutes. And here you're looking at people that perhaps are waiting over an hour just to get a ballot. So that tells us something there about the variety in our country. Think about Chapter 3, federalism. States manage the voting systems, and so there are some huge disparities in our country on the availability of ballots and being able to vote, and being able to vote with a relative limited amount of obstruction in that case. So we can see some differences here. The interesting part is, if you look this over, you might want to pause and think about it. You can see there that income-wise, people with more income actually have to wait longer than those with less income. And this is just the way that our neighborhoods break down and our voting precincts break down. But do note that it's also possible then the reason why people with more money have to wait longer is that people with more money are voting more. And so therefore they have to wait more because there's more of them in line to go vote. So when we look at the definition of voter turnout, it is, as we can see here, the percentage of eligible individuals who actually vote. and some of the requirements that you need to have if you want to go vote. As you can see here, there's not that many requirements really to be qualified to go vote. There's some disparities when it comes to voting. I mean, here's the same state, the same system of voting, and a caucus, which we'll talk about, and we have talked about in some capacities, and we'll bring up in some other systems. People have to turn out to vote at a specific time and announce the candidate they're voting for. And you can see here a considerable difference from 2008 to 2016 on the number of people who voted. And you can perhaps get more people to participate if you would change some of the registration requirements. You can read about that on page 318. So our turnout is, compared to a lot of countries, really not that high, as we can see here. You are getting more than half the public that does turn out to vote, that's qualified to vote, to turn out. You did have a situation in 2012 where African Americans actually voted at a higher rate than white Americans, and that did mean then that they had a higher overall turnout rate in that case. And so, as you can see there, depending on the percentage of people who turn out to vote, you could have a certain percentage of the population and actually have a higher overall percentage of the electorate based on your voter turnout. Women are more likely to vote than men, as we can see there as well. If things continue to stay as they are, then we will certainly continue to see changes in our overall body politic when it comes to voting, the typical voter, where they're from, what they represent, what experiences they've had. Maybe all that will be altered based upon their ethnic background. And, you know, do we assume that people of different ethnic backgrounds have different experiences and have different viewpoints overall? If that's the case, then who is likely to vote will then mean some differences in our overall political structure. And we're on pace to see that change certainly by the year 2024. Midterm elections turn out to be a fewer amount of people that are voting. We may certainly see that different in 2018. We've already seen that in the primaries in the state of Oklahoma. It was a much higher turnout. So we may see that continue to occur. Oklahoma overall is not a state that has that many people voting. As you notice, that 45th out of the 50 states, or 51 if you count a District of Columbia. And you certainly, in the midterm elections, when there's not a president on the ballot, you can have a much lower turnout overall. This was the worst in 72 years, as you can see there. Now, the big issue here is that young people are far more likely to vote in presidential elections, and there are more young people than there are old people. Well, if young people don't vote at higher rates and old people consistently vote, then they're more likely to have strength in those midterm elections. And that's consistently what we see that goes on. So if you notice there's a higher percentage of people in presidential elections, or at least that has been the case, they're going to vote under the age of 30, let's say. But when it comes to the midterm elections, those over the age of 65 continue to vote. They vote at higher numbers because other age groups vote less. And that means then in those midterm elections, they have a much greater voice, the older Americans, in influencing the political system. Think about frequent forms of participation. The most frequent would be going to go vote. But there are other forms of participation. Look on page 291 to be able to see these other forms. I mean, some things such as putting up signs, you can see that that's an activity that some people would certainly be involved in. We can imagine that not as many would do this as those who would certainly go vote, but you can see the likelihood of people to go do these other activities when you read page 291. And it's a low percentage, but still, roughly 1 out of every 20 Americans would in some ways volunteer for a campaign. That's a pretty significant number, and it's great to see young people who are involved in that area. Being involved in town hall meetings, going to community meetings, going to political party meetings, local political party meetings, this becomes very important. Listening to potential candidates, let's say, or local officials in some capacity, perhaps at a school board meeting, for example. And, you know, I do think it's always interesting and important to keep in mind that if you don't go, then those who do go are the people that the leadership will listen to, will hear. So if you have a question, you have a point you want to make, but you don't go to an event, then just assume that somebody else may make a point, may say something that's in opposition to what you believe. And the only way that you could counteract that would be to attend the rally, attend the meeting. You can see here, it's not a very high number, but still roughly 1 out of every 10 Americans would give money to a campaign if these numbers are accurate. And so we can see that that's certainly one way to participate, by making contributions. Certainly more people say they voted than actually really do when we look at the turnouts. Notice here, this is an excellent chart. Spend some time looking this over on page 294. The countries that require people to vote, you have to pay a fine if you don't vote. And we can find that in places like Brazil, Australia. So Germany becomes the country to really focus on here, and to give them their just recognition as a very politically active country where people are likely to vote. A very high percentage of people turn out to vote, and it's not compulsory, and they still go and participate. Why do we have such a low voter turnout? Some explanations for that. We have no voter holiday, so the day people are not off work for that day to go vote. We only have 2 political parties. We'll discuss Duvier's law in some other areas, but if you have a single district, simple plurality system like we have, it's very likely that you're only going to have 2 influential political parties. And if there's only 2, then maybe people are turned off by the system and are less likely to vote. There's no choice that they really like. People just get burned out by the campaigns. They do go on for a very long time. Since this is the election that's focused on the most in your text, that's the one I bring up. But there's really not much difference from 2012 to 2016. I mean, so you have the Iowa caucus, one of the first nominating events in a state, January 2012, and 11 months later you have the election. So you can get a sense there of just how long it may go on. In a much shorter period, for example, in the United Kingdom, people can focus, and it doesn't drain their consciousness too much by the campaign lasting so long. And they just have so many elections, it may be very hard to follow all the different elections that are going on. So if the only election on a ballot sometime in May is a local election, and there's been very little advertisement for it, well, we probably shouldn't be too surprised that it's also not a very high turnout. Do we have a political party that really focuses on working class Americans? And we may not want to think that class is a system that breaks people down, but there's a lot of indication that there actually is that kind of situation in our country. And so to have a political party that would just represent working class Americans, we're less likely to see that here. Where in Germany, there you can see this on the left, the Social Democratic Party. In the center there, you have the Socialist Party in France, you have the Labor Party in United Kingdom, and that's really what their job is all about, and who they're trying to attract to go vote. And does it help to increase the voter turnout overall to have a political party like that? So if voting doesn't really help you, then what do you do? And perhaps the way to go is to protest. And you can read about this on page 289, and confronting officials. And perhaps officials may feel that they don't need to respond to an election, or an election doesn't really let them know how they should respond. Perhaps that's the outcome. So now a protest becomes an alternative. So here we look at who votes. We've already talked about in midterm elections, older Americans are more likely to consistently vote. And overall, then, they're more likely to consistently vote, as we can see here. Older you are, more educated you are, more likely you're going to vote. We still see some differences on race and ethnicity, as we can see here, on who's likely to vote. We see some differences here on which gender is most likely to support which party. So focus on that as you look through here in the chapter 8 on the term gender gap. We see differences too on what people do on Sunday may have an impact then on which party they're most likely to support when elections turn around. So here we're looking at the process of getting people to vote and giving people that right and opportunity to vote. So you have the 15th, 19th, 26th Amendments. These are, again, notice these when you read through the text, ways in which you can get more people to go vote. More than likely, the registration can hold people back in their ability to vote. So if you make changes in the registration system, you can also increase then the voting turnout.